Hi, this is Nancy with On Point TV and Quilting with Nancy. We are continuing our series of the Great Basics. This is my new book, Great Basics, taking you through all the steps to make the quilt that we are going to quilt now. If you're interested in the book or any of the other supplies that we have, you can go to onpoint-tv.com. That's our website, and there's a lot of patterns there and some free tools also, so take a look. We're going to start the quilting process today, and as you can see, we are in my studio. This is where I do most of my quilting. I have a nice strong sewing machine. This is a Pfaff Hobby 1200. It's actually quite old. I think I might be 9-10 years old at this point. It works like a dream. What's really nice about it is it does have this extra space so that my quilt, I've got lots of room to do the quilting. And what I especially like about this machine is its sole goal in life is to machine quilt. It doesn't have any fancy stitches. It cannot zigzag one single stitch. It just goes straight and it goes really, really fast. So I'll talk to you a little bit about that when we're actually doing the quilting. So along with the book, which is a nice tool to have, and in the book I show you some quilting designs that I'm going to do, but here is the other supplies that I'm going to use. On the top, I'm going to start with a So Fine polyester thread. Now, for some of you, that might be a surprise. For the piecing process, I make a big fuss about using 50 weight, 100% cotton thread. It's the only option. But when it comes to quilting, the sky's the limit. If you like the thread and it works in your machine, you may quilt with it. There is a little bit of a trick, though. If the thread that you're going to use on the top is a cotton, then you need to use a cotton thread in the bobbin, either of the same weight or of a lighter weight thread. In this case, I'm going to use a polyester on the top, so I'm going to use a polyester in the bobbin. And I'm going to use these pre-wounds. In this machine, these pre-wounds work great. This is the Super Bobs. This is the bottom line thread. Now, all of these threads can be purchased in a regular spool or in a larger cone, and these ones are available in these pre-wound bobbins, and it just makes life easier for me. So that's what we're going to use, but keep in mind, as I said, they do come in a bigger cone or a regular size spool also. I love the variety of colors that I can get with this too. It just makes life go a little bit faster, so I don't have to be filling bobbins. But I do want to talk to you, I need to take my gloves off to this, about how I put this in my bobbin. Now, this is a front load bobbin as opposed to a bobbin that is a top load on like my other machine. If you were doing the top load, you would do the same thing, but in the front load, this is what I do. I take the bobbin, I put it in like I normally would. All right, so you know how to load your own bobbin. And then I take off this piece of cardboard. Did you see it? That piece of cardboard just comes right off. For me and my machines, the bobbin without the cardboard works best. Now I'm just going to load this in my machine. So like I said, your machine, you know how to load it. I'm going to put my cap down. And then as always, I'm now going to bring my thread to the top. There it is. There's my bobbin thread and my top thread. I do like to use threads that are low in contrast. I've got kind of a burgundy red and a red there. So low in contrast. Don't do a white on the bobbin and a red on the top, because guarantee you will end up having tension problems. So now I'm going to cut my thread a little bit shorter, and I'm going to get ready to start doing the quilting. Now in the book, I'm going to talk to you about what order to do the quilting. And so we're going to start with that simple order. Let me get to the page here. So you're going to start by quilting around the inside edge of the quilt. So that's right inside the border. Then the second stitching line I'll do is right here on the very edge of the quilt. I want to start on the outside edges because remember when we were doing the basting, we wanted the quilt to be very straight. I want to keep those lines very straight. So that's what we're going to start with. So these are Machinger gloves. This is just one of the ways to keep your hands a little bit more comfortable when you're doing the machine quilting. As you see, I have one newer glove and one older glove. That's totally by accident. I just can't find my other new glove. So I have no reason that I have a dark glove and a white glove other than I know I have another white glove around here somewhere. Please forgive me. So we're going to start right here. My first line of quilting will be on the edge of the border. So what I mean and what I'm saying is it's on the ledge. So if you look at this seam, the seam is pressed toward the border. If I were doing in the ditch, I would actually be not on the red fabric. I would be in the pink striped fabric in the ditch, which means between the two fabrics. But instead, I like to be on the ledge, which is maybe a 1/16 of an inch on the red fabric. For me, it makes sense because that is going to secure that seam. So that seam is pressed toward the red. Well, if I'm stitching on the pink, I'm not securing that seam. But if I'm stitching right on the red, I am securing that seam. So I always do my straight lines on the ledge. We're ready to start. I'm going to get into position where I want to be. And the first thing I want to do is bring up my bobbin thread. I'm going to do that by holding my thread and then going needle down and needle up. When I bring my quilt forward and I give it a little tug, there is my bobbin thread, and it's red, so I don't know if you can see it. There we go. There is my bobbin thread. So now I'm just going to pick that bobbin thread up. So now I have my 2 threads that I need to start. Going to tuck those underneath my machine and put my presser foot down. On this machine, I can make the needle stay down, so I'm going to make it stay in the down position. Now I want to talk about stitch length a little bit. For starting, I want to start with a small stitch length. So on this machine, I can just dial it down to almost 0 here. So it's a tiny stitch. That's the locking stitch I like. I'm not a fan of the forward, back, forward. That just creates too much thread in one place. Whereas instead, if you dial down to almost 0, that's going to be such a tiny stitch, it could never come out. And you know that's true because if you've ever accidentally sewn without your stitch at the correct length, you can't ever get those stitches out. So that's how I like to start. So with that tiny stitch, I'm ready to start. Presser foot is down, and I'm going to take 5 or 6 stitches in that little tiny stitch. Then I'm going to dial up to about a 2.5, and now I'm ready to do my straight lines. On my machine right now, the walking foot. Is, you can kind of see this really big contraption here. It's a big kind of thing. Does not normally come with most sewing machines unless your sewing machine is specifically for machine quilting, but this is an add-on foot. And the idea, when this needle goes up, this little arm is making the feed dogs on the top go at the same speed as the feed dogs on the bobbin, which means that the fabric is going to feed through evenly. When you are doing straight line quilting on a quilt, it is so necessary to have that walking foot on. If you don't, chances are your fabric will just start to walk forward as you go. So take your time working it through as you go, and I do like to keep my hands on either side to help keep everything flat. I'm not pushing the fabric through, I'm letting the machine do the work, but I want the fabric to stay still. Then I'm going to stop with my needle down, lift my presser foot, and turn the quilt. Presser foot goes down, and I continue with my straight lines. I'm going to go all the way around the quilt in this manner. So I am coming near the end. Right here is where I started. So I'm going to be on my normal stitch length, getting to where I started. Now I'm going to dial down to that almost 0 stitch length again and take a few tiny stitches. Now this is a tricky little thing. Finding the bobbin thread from here. I like to lift my presser foot, bring the needle up, bring the quilt forward. So here is where I stopped, and here is the quilt. So it's maybe about 3 inches. I'm sorry, here's where I stopped, and here's the needle. Going to put my thumb under that 3 inches of thread and bring the quilt back into place. Hold that loop. I'm holding that loop in my hand. Put my presser foot down again. Do needle down, needle up. Lift your presser foot and bring it forward and look at the magic. When I pull that, there's my bobbin thread, which means now I can cut off my bobbin thread and my top threads. Let me get my scissors here. I'm going to cut them all off at once. So now my bobbin thread has been cut and I did not have to lift up and get underneath my machine. So that's going to be my first line of stitching on the ledge of the first border. My next line of stitching is pretty much going to be the same thing, but this time I'm going to be a little bit less than 1/4 of an inch on the edge of the quilt, and that's going to help keep the border in place so that when I'm quilting it, it won't move. When we come back in a little bit, I'm going to show you how to work with invisible thread in the ditch. So I have the straight lines on my border and on the outside of my quilt done, and it's time for me to start doing the straight lines on the inside of the quilt. I call these stabilizing lines. The idea is that it is going to stabilize that block, so then when I want to do my free motion stitching on the inside, I know nothing can move within that block. So I call it stabilizing. I will oftentimes, not all the time, but oftentimes use invisible thread for this step. So this is a simple spool of invisible thread. There's a lot of different brands, but what is important when you're looking at invisible thread is that you find one that is a very fine weight. It must be 0.004. That's fine. It's not like fishing wire. There are still some companies making some invisible thread that is so thick that it really does not work well in your machine. So avoid those. Find some that have a 0.004. I know that Sulky has a very good one. There's also one really good from Superior Threads. So just those are just two names that I know of. Just look around at your threads so that you know. I also didn't talk about the needle I use. I like to use a top stitch needle. A top stitch needle is going to have a larger groove on the front side of it, so the thread actually rides in the groove very nicely, and that's going to make most threads not break. And not breaking a thread when you're quilting is really a gift, because it's so irritating when you're going along and the thread breaks. When threads don't break, I am so much happier. So using that top stitch, and this time I'm using a 90, oftentimes I'll use an 80, it depends on the thread that I'm using. So starting with the invisible thread, the most important thing about invisible thread to know is it's invisible, which is a good thing and a bad thing. Threading your machine with the invisible thread can try the most patient of quilters. You have to be very calm. You might even want to find a 20-year-old to help you. And I know that sounds awful. I'm just telling you the truth. If you don't want to pull your hair out while threading the invisible thread, then you are a better lady than I am, because it drives me crazy every time. But once you get it threaded, you're usually pretty good. Usually. So I'm going to start stitching with the invisible thread in this corner, and I want to show you why invisible thread. Here is my invisible thread, and you can't even see it. It's between my fingers. But when I put that right next to in that seam, you cannot see the thread. Whereas if I had decided to do the in the ditch with the red thread, you would be able to see it. I could try my best to get it into that little corner, but it's never going to be perfect enough that I wouldn't see it. And if I were using a colored thread going on these seams, this red thread would be between the white and the blue, and you can see that. I know the camera isn't showing it really as much as you really can see it, but you can. And then even between the green and the white. And what would I use? The white or the green? And at some point it would end up on the red. So that when you're doing in the ditch, that's when you want to use invisible thread. So we're going to start right here in the corner, and I've got my machine. I'm going to click it down to my tiny stitches, my foot down, and I'm going to go. So there's my tiny stitches. Then I'm going to dial up, and I'm going to start stitching, and I am trying my best to be right between the pink and the red. Now, one thing people tell you is to kind of pull this. I'm kind of separating that seam a little bit, trying to get that thread right in the ditch. When you come to a corner, you want to try to turn and not have to cut your thread any more often than absolutely necessary. So as I come to the corner, I stop with my needle down, roll my quilt, and spin it around. So now I can put my presser foot down. I didn't have to cut off my thread at all, and I can continue. Another thing that will happen, I'm going to grab my awl here a second, is as you're stitching, so I have already stitched this straight line, but it's an invisible thread, so you can't see it. But even with my walking foot, I want you to watch this bit of fabric as I go. Do you see how that bit of fabric is starting to make a kind of like a little mound of fabric as you come to a line that you've already stitched? That's when I like to use my awl. Take your awl and kind of help the fabric, kind of tucking it inside as I go. And that'll make it so that you won't get a big pleat at that seam. So let's go a little bit farther. Back up a little bit. There we go. Do you see that mound happening right there? So if I get my awl handy, I can take it and push it along, helping get that fabric underneath it. So I'm going to go all the way around this quilt on all of those straight edges, going up and around on each of the long diagonal lines. And I think that once you start, you'll be able to see what it is that is happening. So all of those 6-inch squares will be secured down. So then I will be able to do the free motion quilting, and we'll do that with a colored thread. A lot of people like to free motion with invisible thread because then you can't see the mistakes you make, which is a great idea for that reason, but it's really very difficult to use. Now, if you are happy with your free motion and invisible quilting, go for it, do it. I've never been a big fan of it. So when we come back next time, we're going to be doing the free motion quilting, a couple of different designs I think you're going to really like that are really excellent for beginners to really practice your free motion quilting. If you have any questions, you know to contact me at quiltingwithnancy@gmail.com. If you're interested in the book, you can pick that up at www.onpoint-tv.com. Have a great day.